program, not to an individual unit. And we use the term module to refer to a class, or what we call in the US a course. So some of these little things, if you start looking at websites, can create a little bit of confusion. And then as master's degrees go, there are generally two categories. And again, this is across most of Europe, in fact, most of the rest of the world outside of the US, although Canada frequently follows closer to a US system. But postgraduate taught, or PGT, is always the shortcut to that, are one-year programs generally. Research master's programs are primarily just what they sound like, research. Very few students would go into a research program to start with, master's by research or research master's. You need to have a very well-defined research topic in order to do that. The honest truth about a lot of students who end up with a research master's, it's kind of the off-ramp from a PhD program. If you decide the PhD is not the thing for you after a year or two, don't want to complete the thesis, there's usually an off-ramp to get at postgraduate research. And then we use a lot of different abbreviations. I'm not quite sure why we call our master's degrees so many different things. In the US, we're used to a Master of Arts, a Master of Science, a few named ones for more terminal professional degrees like MBAs or MFAs. But we interchangeably kind of use MLit, Masters of Science, Master of Philosophy. Those abbreviations don't necessarily mean anything about the degree overall. And then kind of the shorter terms are PG Cert or PG Dip, postgraduate certificate, postgraduate diploma. In our coursework masters or postgraduate taught masters, generally, if you decide you've taken 2 semesters of courses and don't want to do the summer project or research, then the off-ramp is you get a postgraduate diploma, which is not necessarily a degree that's well understood in the US and recognized for much of anything. So don't recommend that kind of off-ramp. So the important things to understand about the degree options is the taught degrees. In the case of St. Andrews, we have more than 100 different ones. Generally, across most countries, these degrees are in 2 broad categories, really specializing in undergraduate. And I'll give an example of some of the things St. Andrews does in neuroscience, in biology, or a conversion. So if you want to take a completely new area, so for example, you can often do a master's of management as a completely new area. The other important thing to understand is that outside of the US and Canada, most master's degrees are actually 1 year and not 2 years. So coursework masters are 1 year. They are seen as equivalent to US master's degrees. So that's one of the big advantages to them. Much faster way to get a degree, go on for a master's degree. Research degrees, again, like those master's degrees, PhD is what we're all used to seeing. We do have some Masters of Philosophy, Masters of Research, Masters of Science by Research. So you might see those referred to by a few other things, but not typically what students go into to start with. PhDs in the UK system, and again, in most other places, are research only. There is no coursework component to a PhD. So the typical pathway is actually to start with a 1-year taught program and then move into a 3-year research, because you have to have a really well-defined project and find that faculty member who can sponsor the research you want to do before you're going to be able to even apply to a PhD by research program. So that's why it's kind of a big jump for most US undergraduates. In the case of St. Andrews, we're not a comprehensive university, we do offer a lot of subject areas. St. Andrews does not offer anything in engineering, the performing arts, a few other areas. There are some good sites, and you can simply Google if you're looking for a specific subject area. UCAS, UCAS is good about listing subjects offered at different British universities. Education Ireland does for Ireland. You'll find a variety of places you can see some of those things. I did want to talk about some specific examples at St. Andrews. I can't really, like I said, my expertise is on the systems, not specifically on all of the different offerings that different schools or institutions have. So I can't really go into depth on that. I may know sometimes who does what, but some of the things in life and neurosciences that St. Andrews has, and these are all the one-year taught options. So we have a Master's of Research in Neuroscience, which, just to confuse things a bit more, is actually a coursework master's degree, despite what we call it. Things at St. Andrews get even more confusing because our first degree for students doing a degree in social sciences and humanities is actually called a Master of Arts degree. It's not a master's at all, but we're 600 years old, so we call things what we want to call them. But neuroscience, you can research areas like membrane trafficking, neuroethology, memory mechanisms, and Alzheimer's, synaptic transmissions, and health and disease. We have a Master's of Science in Health Data Science. So those wanting to go a little bit more into that has a focus on computer programming, machine learning, imaging sensing. So a completely different direction, but still might be an interesting way to spend a year for those wanting to maybe have that gap year before going on to a medical degree or something. Sustainable development is another area where you can start getting into some global health, disease and environment, managing nonprofit organizations. So what I would urge you, you can see from these, and then we have animal behavior, we have comparative evolutionary and developmental psychology. So you can see how specific a lot of these degrees get. Generally, the structure, and all the universities have a lot of the same kind of things. Generally, the structure you will see is that students will do 2 to 3 courses or modules in the fall, 2 to 3 courses or modules in the spring. Summer, you will do your research or your project. So really depending on what you want to do. And then usually you'll finish up around end of August to the end of September. Ashlyn, you had a question?
Quick question about for our non-scientist, Max on the line, who's interested in pursuing master's in economics. Can you, I know that's a little bit off topic here, but can you speak to that?
Yeah, so it's going to be the same kind of very specific areas you can do. So you can do things like consumer behavior, you can do portfolio management. So if you go onto our website, you'll see the same kind of very specific courses, the same structure of courses in the fall and the spring. The one difference is that a lot of students in economics would do maybe a group project or maybe a consulting work for a company or something as their project rather than kind of a written thesis. Most of our written theses will be about 15,000 words. So yes, they are long, but they are not ridiculously long in terms of the length of those projects. So it is feasible to get done with that in 2 to 3 months. All right, just see why it wants to go. So generally applying, and this is what a St. Andrews does, but almost all of them are going to follow the same. Remember, if you're looking at Australia or New Zealand, Southern Hemisphere, the start of the academic year is February, not September. Some do have, in some UK universities, we'll have a lot more entry points 2 times a year. St. Andrews does not tend to have as many January entry points. Almost all of our programs start in September. We usually advise students. Almost everyone has a direct application, online application, recommended timeline for most of the Northern Hemisphere would be a November to February timeline to apply. The applications are pretty straightforward. To the best of my knowledge, I can't think of any universities would require anything like a GRE or a GMAT, no kind of standardized tests for most of them. We're really going to be focused on your transcript. We're going to be focused on a statement of purpose in our case, in most of the programs, where you really can explain why St. Andrews or wherever else you may be applying is the right place for you. And we really want you to focus on the subject material and be as specific as possible about the kind of courses or modules that are available at that institution. I usually remind students to just completely forget about how you wrote your undergraduate essays to get into Davidson. We generally, overseas institutions are interested in academic qualifications and academic fit, not in what makes you a leader, what makes you unique, all of the kinds of things that US institutions tend to focus on a bit more. We are interested in why the subject you're applying for. Decisions times vary a bit in the case of St. Andrews. Often you'll hear back in 3 to 4 weeks. Doesn't take really long to do it, to evaluate an application. Our faculty will look at your statement. They'll look at, usually we want one reference from a faculty member or possibly two in some cases. I think that's true across the whole field. Some may have specific courses they would want, but generally they're going to look and say, do you have a solid background in the sciences? Some, like management, for example, you don't have to have any background in management at all. You can go into those areas. In the case of St. Andrews, most of our programs are looking for a GPA of around a 3.2. There are UK universities that would go lower than that. There are some programs that are going to ask higher. In the case of St. Andrews, International Relations tends to be our most competitive degree area. They're going to look for closer to a 3.5. And as I mentioned, those research masters tend to want you to already have a master's degree. And normally you'd go into the research PhD option then and not into a master's degree. Factors, as I said, academic qualifications. In most cases, British universities, most overseas universities, if you are applying straight from undergraduate, are going to look and say, we can make you an unconditional offer because they know if you've been a good student for 3.5 years, it's not going to change in that last half year. So they're going to look for academic references. Some may require a writing sample, depending on the subject area. And personal statement. This does point out, and that is a fair statement, that extracurricular activities are relevant if they're related to what you want to study. Not related to what you want to study, you don't have to worry about that at all. And I would not mention them. Teaching and learning tends to be done in small seminars or in lab work. In the case of St. Andrews, most of our graduate programs are kind of a cohort model. Most don't have more than about 10 or 15 students in that cohort working together, usually 1 or 2 required courses, and then 1 or 2 that are optional modules, depending on your specific interest area. And there is a very strong focus on independent learning. So even in the required modules, you're never going to see a required reading list, for example. It'll be recommended. Reading list, and it's going to be a very long reading list. You get to decide which few articles, books, chapters you want to read that are relevant for your own interest area. So it is more self-directed learning. It's interesting, the pictures chosen here, I would say the top one reflects what postgraduate courses would look like. The bottom one's got to be an undergraduate lecture hall. You would not see a large lecture hall like that at the postgraduate level. Fees and funding are important to understand. Tuitions vary by degree and by institution. St. Andrews tends to be a little bit more on the expensive end because we are one of the most selective British universities. But overall, our master's programs range between 23 to 28,000 pounds this year. So you're talking about 28 to about $35,000. Remember, that is a one-year program. So that is the complete cost, tuition-wise, of your program. St. Andrews does, and I would say about half of the UK universities, probably half of the Irish universities, the more elite Australia and New Zealand universities, all are Title IV eligible institutions, which means you can use student loans should you so desire. You are also not going to have to repay any student loans you may currently have because you're currently enrolled at an institution. There is an availability, I know in the UK, I know Ireland, I know Australia, New Zealand, to work part-time when school is in session, full-time during any breaks. An additional benefit in the case of the UK is once you graduate, you are then eligible to work in the UK for 2 years automatically. So if that's something you want to consider, more of an international experience, that's available to you. A lot of the universities do have some scholarships, but I'll be honest with you, you're not going to find a lot of fully funded places for master's degrees at many of the institutions. There are some competitive fellowship programs. If you're a senior, a lot of those are already kind of deadlines are passed or they'll soon pass. But things like Fulbright, Rhodes, Marshall. So there are some scholarships available. You can check with your own fellowship office at Davidson about that. Some private scholarships, so look around. For example, if you want to go to Scotland, there are many Scottish St. Andrews societies. St. Andrews Society does not refer to the university, but St. Andrews, the patron saint of Scotland. So there are a lot of those. Aisling, you have another question?
I have one more.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we always advise students here in the Matthews Center to that they should, for PhD programs, they should not be paying any tuition for them, that those are fully funded programs. I know you mentioned coming straight from undergrad into a PhD program at St. Andrews would be very challenging. But I guess my question is more for, let's say they did the 1-year master's with the intent of staying on for a PhD in the UK system. Would that be something that would be fully funded? Or are those fully funded opportunities only for citizens?
No, those are typically fully funded for any student.
Oh, good.
Then, and I would advise the same thing, absolutely, and in the UK or most overseas systems. And a little aside, if anybody's open to considering this, Germany does not tend to charge tuition at all and has a lot of master's programs and graduate programs offered in English. So if you really are looking at your cost options, the German government also tends to be quite generous about providing some living stipends and other things. So if you're open to considering Germany, I will tell you, I have a son who's a sophomore in college and studying physics, and I've told him he's probably not going to study abroad, which breaks my heart somewhat because that's the field I've worked in my entire time. But I've told him just wait to do a master's degree. He's studied some German, quite open to that. And I kind of told him that's the best deal you can get generally. If you just want to go on for that master's at first, then decide on that PhD. But in reality, yep, in the UK system, you tend to pay for the master's And then the PhD is 3 years beyond that. That's a funded position. Important, and I would say ask any school, any university, not only overseas one, but US ones as well, about what do the career prospects look like for this. In the case of St. Andrews, 96% of our graduates are in work or further study within 6 months of graduation. So you want to look at those kind of things. And just a little bit, I may actually cut out this part. Another thing I did want to mention is that St. Andrews, and this, if I have any student athletes in this audience, and this is part of why I met with Josh King, why the conversation with Davidson started. If there are any student athletes, if you're graduating, you want to continue playing. There are sometimes scholarships available for students to do a 1-year master's degree and play a sport. There is obviously no NCAA eligibility restriction on you. So you can usually look around at universities, figure out who might have the sport you'd like, contact the coaches. In the case of St. Andrews, the sports in red are ones where we have more of a focus. They are our premier sports, better chance of some funding in that. No surprise for anybody. Golf is one of those, of course. St. Andrews is where golf was invented. We have no fewer than 5 golf courses surrounding the town. So that is something to think about. And there's my contact details, but I'm really happy to answer any questions that anybody may have. Hopefully I've managed to cover enough about that option for you all. So any questions you can type in, I think they can all unmute and ask or raise your hand if you'd like. Aisling, anything that you see I missed at all?
Can you talk about, I mean, you touched a little bit on the cycle. One thing that surprised me was how late the cycle is, that students can apply even in May. Like,
yes, they can.
Yeah. So I guess I just wanted to make sure you all knew about that, that when is like generally the deadline for applications to come in?
July.
Okay.
I don't recommend that, however, and here's the problem with that. You need to apply for a student visa. You need to find housing. If you wait too late, doing all of those things is going to make the process really stressful for you. That's why I highly recommend you look in that November, December, January timeframe, because then you'll hear by February. You can think about, okay, how am I going to fund this? If you need to have that discussion and figure that out, you can start applying for housing. You can apply in a lot of the universities will have graduate student housing available to you. I usually recommend, if you're going for a 1-year program, that's not a bad option, just because it takes some of the stress off of you. And then student visas can take anywhere between a month to 3 or 4 months, depending on the country and some of the requirements.
Okay. And
Caroline.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ashley.
I just had one follow-on question to that. And then Caroline, which is the housing. You talked about the tuition costs. Can you speak to the housing costs just generally?
Yeah. In the case of St. Andrews, our housing is going to run about, depending on the housing you end up with, $750 to about $1,000 a month. But there's going to be a wide variation in that. St. Andrews does tend to be a little bit higher because we're a college town, and a lot of you understand how college towns can be. In Scotland, if you chose Aberdeen or Dundee or Glasgow, you could probably get by in a shared house for $500 to $750 a month. Edinburgh is going to be more expensive because it's the capital city, slightly more appealing. If you want to study in the heart of London, it's going to go way up from there. Dublin's more expensive as well. Sydney and Melbourne are really expensive. So those are all things you want to look at and consider. And I think we all have websites that will explain that. Certainly, if we are offering in Title IV eligible institutions, you should be able to ask them what the expected cost of attendance is, and they can give you that. All right.
Okay. I also have a question. It's like
Yeah.
maybe two parts, but if you wouldn't mind, I'm also just curious about this myself, but just talking about what students do if they are planning on doing this PhD with you and then maybe wanting to go back and get a job in the US. Because I know you mentioned the UK system is different. How transferable is that PhD going to be if I did want to bring that back to the US?
Yep. So I will always tell a student, you really want to look at that and investigate that and ask them, where do your PhD students end up? St. Andrews is in the fortunate position that so many of our students are US students, and so many of our graduates and international. It's a really well-recognized university, ranked first, second, third kind of category in the UK. So if you're then going to apply for a position back in the US, other academics are going to recognize that degree, recognize that institution's name. I'd also suggest, however, if you're doing your PhD, you want to think about, okay, how do I make sure I maintain the network in the US if that's where I want to come back to? And I would suggest that you look at presenting at conferences in the organization you want to be at. So if it is neuroscience, what are the neuroscience conferences and associations in the US? Try to still present in those. You want to get your name out there. You want to make links and contacts. Think about in your PhD, in your committee that's going to review your PhD, because we have committees just like they do in the US. It may be advantageous to make sure or suggest, hey, do you know of any US faculty who could be on this committee? That's going to add another link. Just like in the US, not all the PhD are going to be equivalent. So you need to look and really think about the quality of the institution you're going to, how recognized is that degree. There are some rankings. It can be helpful. There's one commonly used one for international schools called QS rankings. You can look those up. And if the institution you're thinking about is low on that list, you may want to think twice about it. Although the reality is St. Andrews does not rank. We rank about 95th in the world or 96th in the world. Still very good, but not as high as we rank in some other things, because St. Andrews doesn't have a medical program. We don't have engineering. We don't have the same research dollars that some other UK universities or the big US research universities do. So that's always a little bit of a battle for us. So I would say even those rankings, you need to consider the context and ask people about why are you ranked where you are. And it may be that one specific subject. If you want to do medieval history, we're good with medieval history, but I'd tell you in a heartbeat, go to the UK, you want to go to York. York may not be ranked as high in other things, but for that specific topic area, it is absolutely the best option you can do. So that's the other thing I would advise you about. You want to look very closely at rankings of the specific field you're in. Look at where the faculty members are from. If all the faculty members are from the university itself, if that's where they have their degrees from, that's a red flag. And that's a red flag at a US institution too, by the way. You want to make sure and look, are the faculty from recognizable institutions? Are they presenting at conferences and other things? Do they hold leadership roles in their field? Those are all things that you want to look at that hold true in any system if you're looking at PhDs.
Okay, thank you so much. That's so helpful.
Yeah. Any other questions? If not, you should see my email. You feel free to reach out to me if it's about St. Andrews, if it's about someplace else, something about structures, things like that. I'm always happy to give students some advice.
Well, we really appreciate it. And you clearly are an expert on St. Andrews, so thank you for all of that. Students definitely take advantage of John's offer to kind of get his thoughts. You know, he knows things about the UK system that would be hard to maybe suss out otherwise. So it's worth just placing a phone call or email. I can tell you he's extremely responsive, so which I appreciate. And so don't hesitate to reach out. Any last questions before we wrap up? No. All right, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Caroline, for co-hosting this evening. Thank you, John, for an excellent presentation. Have a good evening, everyone.